Today we're exploring two closely connected worlds, the medical knowledge of the ancient Greeks and how it was preserved, transformed and passed down by scholars in the Oriental world. Greek medicine can feel sometimes surprisingly modern, and in the works of Hippocrates and Galen we see early efforts to understand the body, diagnose illness, and even develop a kind of medical ethics. But that knowledge didn't survive on its own. Without the work of later translators, doctors and thinkers, especially during the Islamic Golden Age, much of it might have been lost. To help us explore this extraordinary journey of medical knowledge, I am joined by Professor Peter Pormann, Professor of Classics and Graeco-Arabic Studies at the University of Manchester. He is one of the world's leading authorities on the transmission of Greek medical knowledge, with over 190 publications, including major monographs, critical editions and translations. His work has redefined the field. He has led internationally acclaimed projects including the recovery of lost Syriac texts and the pioneering use of digital tools to study ancient manuscripts. His contributions span from Hippocrates and Galen through Avicenna and Arabic medical commentaries and into modern understandings of medical history, bridging cultures, languages and centuries of scholarship. Elected to the Academy of Europe and recognised with multiple international awards, Professor Pormann has shaped how scholars across the disciplines understand the history of medicine, translation and cross-cultural knowledge. He is quite simply one of the most important figures working in this field today. Professor Pormann, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Will, and thanks for the kind introduction.
Well, I thought we could briefly begin with what we know about the state of medicine maybe before the Greeks, before we move into the Greek period, say how it existed maybe in Mesopotamia, Egypt or...
Yes, so, obviously the care for the body must have been something universal, not just to us humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, but also our ancestors. Like when you get wounded, you will want to heal. Now, obviously, we don't have much information about this, but for instance, there are like some trepanning devices are found on trepan skulls in the paleographical records, where basically people drilled holes in order, apparently, to relieve blood pressure from the brain. So even before we have texts, we see a certain amount of care for the body. Now, if we look to the two great cultures that precede those of the Greeks, you mentioned ancient Mesopotamia, that's one of them, and the other is obviously ancient Egypt, and there for millennia people have written texts that deal with health, and one prominent scholar of Mesopotamian medicine, Stoll, a Dutchman, has defined or has named Mesopotamian medicine as an antecedent to the Greek medical tradition, so they were also concerned with things like epilepsy and other things. Now, often their approach was also guided by divine rites, appeals to various deities. But that's for the Mesopotamian tradition. And in ancient Egypt, obviously, mummification led to an exploration of the body, but we have there's a famous Ebers papyrus, so we have some medical texts which are very, very old and that describe various medical techniques. So both these cultures have developed medical ideas, and if we take the beginning of Plato's Timaeus, we see basically there's a frame where the old Solon tells where the old Solon basically says that as a young man he went to Egypt and met with the Egyptian priest, and the Egyptian priest said to Solon, "Aepaides est," you Greeks are always children. So basically, even in the Greek tradition, there was a sense that Egypt was really like a very sophisticated culture.
So what made the ancient Greeks' medicine unique in the ancient world? What changed it to our modern perspective from what went before?
Well, so people have argued that there's a shift from irrationality to rationality, but I don't believe in that argument. What we have simply is so there's a wave of texts that appear in the 5th century, what we now call the Hippocratic corpus, so medical works such as the aphorism, the epidemics, as waters places, nature of men, various medical texts basically that try to come up with a physiological, with a natural explanation for disease. So one text on the sacred disease famously rejects the idea that epilepsy, which is the sacred disease, that epilepsy is sent down by the gods, and says that in reality it has to do with the phlegm in the brain and other causes, and I won't go into all the details. And so there's like this explosion of texts that we have that go beyond what we have from either Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia, and it seems that there is also significant progress in the methods and the approaches that are made. And so basically this happens from the 5th century onwards and leads to a significant development, namely it helps shape medicine for the next 2,200 years or so.
So is it fair to say that the Greeks wrote things down for sure, but they were pioneering the idea of creating a kind of a corpus of medicine in a way that maybe the Egyptians weren't, or have we lost texts?
No, I mean, but we lost texts we lost texts left, right, and center. So for ancient Mesopotamia, for Egypt, we lost loads of texts. So, but we have like this large body of texts on medicine that we have different approaches, but they are like sophisticated debates, for instance, about medical epistemology. So how do we know that a drug works or that a treatment works? That there's a text called On Ancient Medicine in the Hippocratic Corpus, which is famous for that. So there are sophisticated debates basically that emerge in the 5th century and that have a level of sophistication, philosophical depth that we don't find earlier on, as I understand it, although one more time, I'm not an expert on Egyptian or Mesopotamian sources.
So like figures like Hippocrates and Galen, they kind of loom large in the...
Yes, but I have to say, like, Hippocrates, the man, and the works attributed to Hippocrates are two separate, obviously interlinked things. So we have this Hippocratic corpus, maybe some 55, 56 texts. It depends a little bit on how you count it. Some of them are from the 5th century BC. Others are later, maybe 4th century. Some are as late as possibly the 2nd century AD. They're attributed to Hippocrates, but we can't be certain that they were by the historical Hippocrates. So we know that there was a famous doctor called Hippocrates. We know this from Plato, we know this from Aristotle. But which works he has written, we can't tell. That is different with Galen. But so Hippocrates becomes a figurehead. He's the father of medicine. He's the greatest doctor there is or there ever was. And that image becomes incredibly powerful. But we just have to remember that we don't know for certain which works of the Hippocratic corpus, if any, he wrote.
So we hear a lot about Hippocrates and Galen, but there's other figures like Rufus of Ephesus, etc. What sort of what did they introduce into, or what did he introduce into the?
So Hippocrates lived probably in the 5th century BC. Now, if you go down to Rufus of Ephesus, he lived around around the year 100 AD, so like late 1st, early 2nd century AD. So he's a doctor who wrote a number of treatises, for instance, on jaundice, on how to talk to patients, on nomenclature of parts of the, basically anatomical technical terms and so on and so forth. So he wrote many, many monographs on buying slaves, on sex, for instance. Some of these works are lost. I myself have worked on one of his works that is partially lost, which is on melancholy, so basically a form of madness. So on mental diseases. So Rufus of Ephesus was a Hippocratic in the sense that he held Hippocrates in high esteem, and he follows what we call humoral pathology, the idea that blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, when in balance, those are the four humors, when in balance basically lead to health, and their imbalance causes disease. It's a theory that is first formulated in a Hippocratic text called On the Nature of Man, probably from the 4th century BC, and that is then becomes very powerful. And Rufus, for instance, adheres to it, but then obviously goes beyond it. In anatomy, for instance, he's far beyond things that we have in the Hippocratic corpus. Now, you mentioned Galen. Galen lived from 129 to 216 AD, and he is by far the most influential doctor, and he is the one of whom we have the most works. I mean, many of his works are also lost, but we have an enormous amount of writings, and he is incredibly influential. And he basically takes the example of Hippocrates and also follows this humoral pathology, but then basically develops his own theories and basically often attributes his own ideas to Hippocrates to lend them authority.
So, this is a general history question, but to what extent does the history of medicine involve incremental progress, and to what extent is it the history of great men or great minds who really push the field forward?
Well, so the problem is what is left, you see. So let's say female doctors. So we have some inscriptions where you have medica or iatraina, so a female doctor in Latin or Greek, but we know nothing about her. They occasionally occur, sometimes we see them, but we know nothing about them. And then we have the texts, and the texts are mostly written, as you say, by great men. We've mentioned Rufus of Ephesus, we've mentioned Hippocrates, Galen, we could mention other authors, Soranus, Celius Aurelianus, Paul of Aegina. There are many names that I could mention, but it's nearly always, in medicine, nearly always a man. And those are the sources, basically. And then you can try to find out more about, maybe from other, let's say, how did patients feel? You could turn to novels or to other forms of evidence, but the problem is that the medical texts that we have are written by these, in inverted commas, great men. Now, I don't see the history of medicine as a history that leads basically from kind of one of gradual progress that leads towards the present. We call this Whiggish history, W-H-I-G, Whig, from the political movement in the 19th century. Basically, you look at the present and then you try to see how did we get to our present state of affairs. But history of medicine is far more interesting, and we have to take basically the doctors and the medical ideas. We have to see them in their own context and take them on their own merits. And trying to find the present in the past is often not very helpful.
Well, in terms of trying to find the present in the past, what are the most kind of surprising or sophisticated aspects when looking at ancient medicine from a diagnostics or therapeutic point of view, where we look at what the ancients were doing, and it's surprisingly similar to how we do it today?
And that's a kind of question which I don't like that much, because you're basically asking me to find what we do today in the past. So no, there's very little that they did exactly like how we do it today. I mean, you can find parallels, of course. So when we talk about mental diseases, for instance, obviously they encountered some of the same problems, some of the same symptoms, but and some of the therapeutic approaches were similar to what one might do today, talking to a patient or try to keep him happy, or not leaving the patient alone. Okay, so I'm not saying that everything that is in ancient medicine cannot be recognized as, or cannot have a parallel nowadays, but most of what they did is completely different from what we do nowadays. But that doesn't make it uninteresting. It is just that basically in medicine there was this big break in the second half of the 19th century. Nowadays modern medicine adheres to completely different philosophy, understands the body completely differently from the way it was understood in the past, and so our modern ideas cannot be, for the most part, cannot be found in the ancient texts.
So, talk about how the placebo effect and it affected the effectiveness of ancient medicine, and to what degree it played a part in healing. Because obviously, to some degree, even the way you've described patient care and how not leaving the patient, all of these things could have sort of contributed to the kind of effectiveness of medical care. How much a part do you reckon the placebo effect was playing?
Well, I mean, for me, placebo effect is code for we don't know. I mean, even in modern medicine, if you see what I mean. So we try to quantify what we can't understand, namely why patients get healed through other means than the ones that we know. And obviously this must have played an enormous part also in the past. Now there's like one author called Wooten, who wrote a book, Bad Medicine, Doctors Doing Harm Since Hippocrates. Like this is like maybe 15 years back or something like that. And he argued in his book that ancient medicine or medieval medicine is basically rubbish. Like it did more harm than it helped, and because he looked at what was his methodology. He looks at let's say a certain therapy or a drug that is recommended for a disease, and he says, from a modern point of view, there are no active ingredients. It doesn't do anything, or it can only be harmful. Therefore, it must be bad. But so the placebo effect will, of course, explain how or why doctors in the past were very successful. There were famous doctors, like they had a lot of success, so they must have done something right. Now I don't know how or why, and placebo effect, great, but as I say, placebo effect, it must have played a role. But for me, that is code for, even nowadays, we don't understand the body, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. So
and we don't understand why some people get well and others don't.
So if we use placebo effect for sort of coders, we don't know. Why did real medicine, in a sense, or the way I'm probably incorrectly describing it as real medicine, why was that so successful, and why did it take off over, let's say, magic or religion? Why did the idea that someone from the outside may have is, you have magic, you have religion, it's not very effective, and slowly kind of real medicine takes over because it's more effective, and people say, oh, well, this is effective, so they kind of follow that road. But if there's this kind of unquantifiable, we don't know, placebo effect kind of thing happening within medicine, what made real medicine take off in any way when they could have just as effectively kind of been healed with, as you say, less, potentially from the medical point of view, less harmful therapies which involved magic or religion?
Well, this is what I mean, that the doctors must have got something right. So the advice must have been right at times, so this is why they were successful. But it's a very good question, because we talked about the distinction between this move from irrational to rationality. But if you look at a text like on the sacred disease, the explanation for epilepsy given there from our point of view is completely wrong. The remedies proposed are completely wrong. So how is that different from doing an incantation or something like that? So that's a very good question, very good point. So my answer would be, the doctors must have got something wrong and something right, and they must have successfully treated patients, and more so than others. But we should also not forget that this idea, divine healing, and let's say what you call real medicine, let's say the Hippocratic medicine, they are in opposition, but they are not. I mean, if you look at a guy called Elias Aristides, an orator from the 2nd century A.D., he strongly believes in Apollo, and spends a lot of time at the temple in Pergamum, whilst also basically consulting doctors and using, let's say, this Hippocratic medicine. So they are not diametrically opposed to each other.
So there is something extra there potentially that we're missing, that we don't really know how.
Sure, but we don't have any numbers. We don't have any. I can't tell you how successful this doctor or that doctor was. We don't have. I mean, we have some records of individual patients, for instance, in works like the epidemics on Rufus's case notes that have come down to us, but we can't say. We can't make any statistical pronouncements, anything like that. So it's incredibly difficult. So I can only say, well, it was a very sophisticated medicine that evolved into many different branches, even if from a modern point of view, some of or many of the things, especially on the level of therapeutics, seem to us nowadays to have no benefit. This said, the doctors must have cured a significant number of patients, and the placebo effect probably played a role.
The Hippocratic Oath is often seen as like the foundation of medical ethics. So, like we discussed before, how real is the connection to Hippocrates himself? And what did doing no harm actually mean in a world where you have such high medical uncertainty? You don't have data, you don't have numbers. So when we're talking about doing no harm, so like in the Hammurabi Code, you have a very clear idea. If a physician operates, he causes a man's death, then he gets his hands cut off. So you have a very clear, you cause death. This is the idea of harm. But in the Greek world, without data, what was their idea of causing harm? Because it's a very uncertain profession.
Yes, but I mean, still, if better to do nothing than to cause harm. Also, like Ophilein and Meblaptain, to help or at least not to harm, is a famous injunction. But undoubtedly, sometimes doctors caused harm. But for instance, there's a book called Prognostic, and in the Hippocratic Corpus, and also like Galen wrote on prognostic. So like this idea that it is important for a doctor to be able to predict the course of disease. So basically, ideally you can tell the past. So you see a patient and you can already tell him, oh, you feel this or this is wrong with you. So that instills confidence in the patient, because you basically predict what has happened to him. You know the present, and then you predict the future. So if somebody is going to die, then you better tell them that's going to happen, because, or say like, I can't do anything for you or whatever. So this idea of being able to predict diseases, prognostics basically, is very, very important from the Hippocratic times, and basically also to a certain extent protects the doctor, right? So the Hippocratic Oath, you ask me, was it written by Hippocrates? Probably not. I mean, we don't know who wrote it. There are various theories out there. I mean, one scholar, Ludwig Edelstein, who had to flee the Nazis and basically made his career in the University of Baltimore in the U.S. He says that it's probably like a Pythagorean community, where because there's the phrase occurs in a pure and holy way, Hosius kai hagnos. So this basically is seen as this idea not to cut, not to give abortive pessaries and stuff like that. Things that occur in the oath, they are all basically the preservation of life. And he had like this idea, this might be Pythagoreans, but that has more or less been disproved. Very, very few people believe this nowadays, but we just simply don't know. But in antiquity, everybody took the Hippocratic Oath or anything like that. That never happened. And the Hippocratic Oath doesn't play much of a role in antiquity, especially on the Greek side, in regulating medical ethics either.
So explain briefly the empiricist versus rationalist schools of thought for those who are kind of new to the idea.
Sure. So according to Galen, there are three sects: empiricists, rationalists, and Methodists. So the empiricists basically say that we cannot know the inner workings of the body. We cannot ever know like the exact causes, the the hidden causes of disease and so on and so forth. So what we do is we do what works. So how do we find out what works? We observe for ourselves. This is called autopsia. We write down or we collect the observations of others, historia, so by the accounts of other people's experience, and then there's something called transfer, metabasis to homoio as to homoion, so the transfer from similar things, so maybe from hand to foot, so cream on the hand might work or as a cream on the foot, or like if you don't have lemon, maybe use limes or something like that. So this is basically their idea. You could say that they are skeptics, so they're close to the philosophical school of skepticism, and they say, we don't seek to know the inner causes of the body. We don't need to do dissection and anatomy and all that stuff to any great extent. Especially inner anatomy. What we do is we do what works. So the rationalists say we need to find out the inner workings of the body, the causes, we need to understand the body in order to come up with treatments. So the empiricists use experience, empiria, pera, and the rationalists use reason, logos, hence they are called logikoi. The third sect are the Methodists, not to be confused, obviously, with the modern religious movement or Christian denomination. They basically have a different. They think of pathways in the body, and they think that the body can either be flux, so things run through the body too quickly, or there can be stricture, things are blocked somehow, or there can be a bit of both. And these are these three states. Or communities, koinotetes in Greek, and they are basically the third sect that of which we know, according to Galen.
We'll come later to Ibn Sina, but didn't he have the idea of kind of a middle ground, like a qualified?
The idea of qualified experience is one already developed by Galen. So di horis mene pera. Qualified experience. So Galen was somebody, he didn't say he was an empiricist or a rationalist. He basically said that you need experience, but it needs to be qualified by reason. And of course you need to understand the workings of the body, but your experience must also guide you in trying to find remedies. So he develops this concept of qualified experience, and that's already in Galen, and later Islamic physicians of various kinds also adhered to this notion.
So what is it? Why was it that doctors in the ancient, especially in the Roman world, were seen as sort of incompetent or greedy or sometimes kind of dangerous? They ended up getting quite a bad reputation. Is that just the nature of the profession being, sort of messing with danger, like breaking a couple eggs to do some healing? What was it? Is there a deeper cultural thing?
Well, I don't know. People already make fun of doctors in Aristophanes. So I can't answer that. If you look at the ethical treatises in the Hippocratic Corpus and also later texts, for instance, in Galen and elsewhere, Rufus, there's often this idea that you shouldn't be greedy as a doctor. But obviously some people still were. And
because it's a totally different attitude. Doctors today, they're sort of on a pedestal. People are kind of respectful towards the profession.
Well, I certainly also know doctors being made fun of.
I guess in America they are considered.
Not just in America. Dr. Oz and his supplements. No, obviously I don't want to denigrate anybody, but I'd be careful with. I'd say doctors can be seen as greedy also today, and there's a lot of criticism. For instance, if you take a place like the US, how drugs are prescribed and marketed and so on and so forth. But that takes us far away from antiquity.
Before we move on to the Oriental world, I was going to ask about the physical texts themselves. Like, you work on these
Palimpsests.
Palimpsests. And what sort of, have we had any big revelations that they've revealed things that we wouldn't otherwise?
Yes. So basically, how do we get the text? I mean, if I can just take a minute to explain that. I mean, in the good old days, basically, people wrote mostly on papyri, and they were scrolls. And the codex, so the book that you open, as we do nowadays, is an invention of the 2nd, 3rd century A.D. And then basically things get copied and copied and copied. And the copies we have are mostly from the Middle Ages, let's say, from the 10th to the 15th century. I mean, there are others older, but so there's some stuff on papyrus, but the majority, the most important witnesses for the Greek text that we have are basically manuscripts from the Middle Ages, and then they were edited in the Renaissance, and then they were translated into Latin and later into, let's say, English. And that process, to a certain extent, is still ongoing. Now, of course, many texts in this process of copying, of transmitting something from papyrus, let's say, onto parchment, and then from one parchment manuscript to another parchment manuscript. In that process, some things don't get copied, texts get lost. And so there are some spectacular new finds, basically. So, and they can happen by finding new papyri. So basically, in the sense of Egypt, there are new texts that come to light. It can happen that you find a manuscript that was overlooked. So a very important manuscript on Mount Athos in one of the monasteries of Vladaton, basically contained a text of Galen that we thought lost, and then it was edited for the very first time, I think, in 2003 or something like that, and then people have spent a lot of time and effort basically rediscovering it. You ask about palimpsests. So palimpsests are texts that have been erased. So let's say a medical text was erased and then something else was copied over it, let's say like a liturgical text or something like that. In that area too we have found new evidence, absolutely. But as always, the largest finds often, not always, but often come from finding overlooked manuscripts.
Is there a place where you are kind of hopeful that more manuscripts can come from and further?
Well, I mean, I work, as you know, I work with the Arabic material, so that's a little bit different. But India, Pakistan, Turkey. I mean, the Turkish collections have been catalogued quite thoroughly, but you can't rule it out. Timbuktu. I mean, so sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, there are like so many libraries where we just simply don't know what they have, and they haven't been catalogued. And so, we are still discovering new texts, basically. So that's
kind of super exciting stuff in a way, because in the history, I mean, you've got obviously the archaeologists that discover new stuff, but in the history profession in general, not a lot of properly new stuff is being kind of introduced into the field in this way. It's kind of a...
Well, we are very lucky because medicine, especially medicine in the Islamic or like in Arabic, is a very under-researched topic. And it's a huge tradition and very few people work on it. So for instance, to give you just one example, I had a project from 2012 to 17 to edit, basically, to produce preliminary editions of commentaries on the Hippocratic aphorisms. Aphorisms is a text, life is short, the art is long. That's the beginning of the first aphorism. So there's a commentary by Galen, and then that's an Arabic translation of this, and then there's some 15 commentaries in Arabic. Now, we edited the whole thing. It's 1.5 million words. Most of this had never been edited before. 2 of the commentaries had been edited before, but the rest hadn't. And basically, it's so easy to say something new if you have like a completely new source that nobody ever looked at. So if somebody has Arabic, or if a student comes to me and says, I want to do work on something new, it's very easy to direct that student to a text that is still not edited, that only exists in manuscript, and tell him or her, have a go at it.
For students, this is like a kind of gold mine of dissertations, PhD.
Yeah, and
thesis.
it's also easy because if you have a new source that nobody has read, it's not so difficult to say something new. So, I mean, I publish perhaps more than some other colleagues. One of the reasons why I can publish so much and relatively quickly is that I have new sources, and so it's very easy then to say. I mean, if I have a new source, I don't need to read 300 books that have already been written. I mean, if I worked on Homer, there are probably like 50 books published each year, or maybe more. I don't know. So it's easy to stay on top of the field if there is nobody who has worked on it. So that makes it makes it very easy, basically.
Great recruitment material for new students. So I know you've already addressed this in some of your books and on multiple occasions, but for the audience today, explain why you use the term Oriental as opposed to Islamic.
So I used it in my doctoral dissertation, The Oriental Tradition of Paul of Aegina. But I've moved away from that. So basically, with Edward Said, Orient and Orientalism has become a dirty word. And the idea is basically because it is linked to a certain colonial mindset that tries to seek knowledge about the Orient in order to rule it. So I mean, I have no interest in ruling anybody. So I no longer use it. I nowadays I talk about medicine in the Islamic tradition or something like that, or medicine in Arabic, and prefer that. But with all these terms, if you say Arabic medicine, then basically one of the most important authors of Arabic medicine is a guy called Avicenna or Ibn Sina, who's a Persian, but he wrote in Arabic. So if you say Arabic, you exclude some people. If you say Islamic, then you include the many Jews and Christians who wrote in Arabic on medicine, living in the medieval Islamic world. So none of these terms is easy.
There's no winning when it comes to the...
No. And some of my colleagues prefer to use the term Islamicate, but I hate it. But I mean, I don't need to go into this now.
So what was it about the Islamic world or the Oriental world, or whichever word people prefer to use, that were culturally or intellectually or even theologically that made it such a uniquely kind of fertile ground for preserving, translating, and even building on kind of this Greek medical knowledge?
Well, I mean, I always think multiculturalism, but maybe that is a biased answer. But the Islamic tradition was best when it was open onto the other, when it had no problem basically reading other people and engaging with them and bringing people together. So if you look at places like Baghdad, maybe 500,000 inhabitants, from all over the world, speaking many languages, Jews, Christians, all sorts of people living together in relative harmony. I mean, I'm not saying that there was never any strife or tension, but I mean, all in all, and then this curiosity, not to say we want. There's an alleged hadith, utlub al-ilm hatta fi Sin, seek knowledge even in China. So this idea that you go wherever you need to go. I mean, there's a famous passage in Al-Kindi's book on metaphysics in which he says that we should not be shy to seek knowledge wherever it comes from, even if it's from far-flung nations, nothing to him, La awla li talib al-haq min al-haq. For him who seeks knowledge, nothing is more important than knowledge. For him who seeks truth, nothing is more important than the truth. So the truth can be found in many different places, and we should embrace this. So basically, that culture, embraced these different traditions, embraced Greek culture massively, and adapted and adopted it, and so basically that made it so strong and also so attractive. So I mean, but obviously these things are multi-causal, and you can't just say one thing led to its success.
Is it fair to say that some of this medical knowledge would have already been in the ether at the time? So a lot of it was kind of common knowledge, maybe one of the reasons could be that in Europe a lot of this kind of knowledge was much more quickly forgotten from the kind of general knowledge of the population, and some of this knowledge is kind of that we think of as being passed down was just generally being used by people.
Well, I mean, so this is like a bit of a complicated question. So in the East, so in the Hellenistic world and the successor kingdom, so to speak, human pathology was very dominant, and undoubtedly it is true that when, let's say, the Muslim armies conquered whatever they conquered, that people were familiar with human pathology and used it, and so it was already in the air. You didn't need the translation movement or the translation of a text like On the Nature of Man, which then gets translated as Fi Tabiat al-Insan into Arabic. You didn't need this translation basically in order to understand or know what human pathology is. So that's certainly the case. In Europe and in the West, it's a bit more difficult. We talked briefly about the three sects and Methodism. So Methodism was very successful in the Latin West and continued till maybe the 11th, 12th century as a fairly strong tradition there, and was then replaced by human pathology with the influx of Latin translations of Arabic texts, and the Arabic texts standing in this human pathology tradition. So there it's a bit different.
So how do we distinguish between like genuinely new innovations and stuff that, like we say, was already within the zeitgeist or kind of in the air in the era?
Well, it's very hard to say when did somebody invent something, because so many texts are lost, right? So therefore, what I try to do is to see like how do things develop. I'm not trying to say, like, oh, this guy is the first who used a needle or this or that. But, like, for instance, so there's a physician called al-Zahrawi in Muslim Spain around the year 1000. And he writes a medical encyclopedia, the last book of which is on surgery. And he has, like, many instruments. And it appears that there are quite a few instruments. I mean, we see them for the first time in al-Zahrawi. And therefore, you could say he invented these instruments. You see, but maybe he didn't, and there was some other guy, and he took it from the other guy, and his text is lost. So because the loss is so great, we can't ever be certain. But we can see that there are, for instance, new instruments, new procedures, or like in that sense, innovation. A massive field of innovation in the Islamic traditions also. Pharmacology, because you have all these new drugs from the East that were unknown to the Greeks. They come in from India and China, and they're integrated into this framework of human pathology. So it's you see like new recipes and these recipe books. They have quite an impact also on medicine in Europe.
Before we get on to like individuals, who would you say are like the maybe four biggest names from the Islamic Oriental world who affected the tradition of medicine?
So, sure. So the very biggest name, without any doubt, is Avicenna ibn Sina, Abu Bakr Muhammad. No, sorry. Avicenna ibn Sina lived from 980 till 1037, and he writes the Canon of Medicine and Medical Encyclopedia in 5 books. He writes other medical texts as well, but that basically is a watershed and defines how medicine is done for the next 700 years, let's say. So, and even nowadays is eagerly read and used on the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere. So Avicenna is the biggest name. My favorite is Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known as the Razes in European sources, and he died around 925, so he's earlier, and he's for me the greatest clinician of that period. I mean, he has like a book of case notes, but he also writes commentaries. He we are lucky he had he kept files basically of text that he read, and his students after his death edited those and published them posthumously as what we know as the comprehensive book, Al-Kitab al-Hawi. He writes his own medical encyclopedia, the book for Al-Mansur, Al-Kitab al-Mansuri. So he's absolutely top drawer. So these are two absolutely great names. We must undoubtedly also include Hunayn ibn Ishaq. So he's a Christian author. He's the main translator of Greek medical texts into Syriac and Arabic. He lived roughly from 806 till 873 or 76. We don't have his exact dates. So he translates a lot, but he also writes his own works. For instance, the 10 treatises on the eye, Ashar Maqalat fil Ayn, which is in the realm of ophthalmology. There are apparently new diseases that are discovered. So Panus, for instance, is one of them, called Sabal in Arabic. And then, if you want to name a fourth one, I think I would say maybe we can add Maimonides to it. So this is an author who dies in 1204. He's the greatest Jewish thinker of all times. So Hunayn was Christian, Maimonides is Jewish, and he writes some very, very interesting books. So he's basically court physician to sultans at the court in Cairo, and some of his writings are extremely, extremely interesting. Now, he's probably not the most prolific in the area of medicine, but he is such a great thinker and so influential in Judaism that I think we can name him. So if you want to remember four names, if we do it in chronological order: Hunayn ibn Ishaq, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, Ibn Sina, and Maimonides. And then you have basically a Christian who grew up speaking Syriac and Aramaic dialect and learned Arabic later. Then you have two Persians, al-Razi and Avicenna, who basically spent their careers, or a lot of their careers, writing Arabic. And then you have a Jew originally from Muslim Spain, who basically spends most of his life and career at Cairo. So it shows you already this, a Christian, a Muslim, two Muslims, and a Jew, and even the nature of how Muslim they were is disputed. For instance, al-Razi, for his philosophical views, is also seen as a bit of a heretic, if you see what I mean.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that soon. But in terms of these kind of scholars, al-Razi, Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Sina, Maimonides, so obviously they're copying, they're interpreting existing text from the Greek tradition. They're introducing new things. What are the big kind of breakthroughs? You said al-Razi is really the kind of your sort of favorite, biggest kind of breakthrough scholar. And obviously Ibn Sina totally transformed. How did they transform both from a medical point of view, but also from the kind of philosophical point of view?
Well, that's a big question, but okay. So let's take al-Razi. So he writes a treatise on smallpox and measles. Kitab fil Judari wal Hasba in Arabic, and he basically does a differential diagnosis between these two conditions. And apparently, I mean, although there's some debate, he's the first to do so. So basically, you recognize basically new diseases. So where do you see progress? You recognize new diseases. You describe things for the first time. That's one of them. Or I mentioned Panus, Hunayn ibn Ishaq. He might have gotten this from his teacher, but let's say in that tradition, basically Panus. So basically, it's an overgrowth over the length. Is is described for the first time. So you basically recognize a new disease. That's one way of how you have progress. Another way of how you have progress is to you invent new institutions. So, for instance, hospitals in the Islamic world become institutions that differ greatly from their Byzantine antecedents. And so I would say, or I've certainly argued, that there's progress in the institutional development of these places. So you find new drugs, you find new treatments. I mentioned new instruments. I mentioned new drugs from the East that are introduced. That's progress. There's progress in medical epistemology. So basically, if you take somebody like Avicenna ibn Sina, we talked already about the concept of qualified experience. So he qualifies at the beginning of the second book of the Canon of Medicine. So the second book of the Canon of Medicine is basically on simple drugs, and he has a theoretical discussion on how what conditions need to be met in order for drug tests to be valid. And so the way the conditions he gives, or the way he describes this, differs from those that came before him. So you can see that there is progress in thinking about how to test drugs, for instance. I'm not saying it's how we test drugs nowadays, but there's internal progress. So you have on the level of epistemology, pharmacology, instruments, institutions, like differential diagnosis, you have basically progress or development in all these areas, and more.
What role did religion or philosophy play in shaping medical thought in that period? Because we know, for example, like al-Razi, I think this might be Ibn Sina, but his religious and medical opinions don't always match up. So maybe his religious opinions on sex might be one thing, but his kind of medical opinions.
Well, I think you referred to I wrote a short article called al-Razi on the benefits of sex. So the problem is, in one of his philosophical works, he says, abstain from sex. Basically, he takes a bit of a stoic position, no need, sex not good. But in his medical works, or in his works, he has two works on sex, on sexual intercourse. He says there are benefits and then harmful effects as well. So he has a more nuanced position. So that's that can happen. So basically, according to genre, popular ethics, or medicine, you develop slightly different ideas. In general, philosophy was extremely important. Galen wrote a treatise, Hotiho Aristos Iatros Kai Philosophos, that the best doctor is also a physician, translated also into Arabic. And this idea that physicians should have a good knowledge of philosophy is an old one, and you will see that many of the doctors in the Islamic tradition are also philosophers. So Avicenna, for instance, is a major philosopher. Al-Razi is a major philosopher. Unfortunately, because his ideas were so radical, quite a few of his works are now lost, so it's a bit more difficult to reconstruct his works. But I could name other people who are, doctors and theologians at the same time. So that happens a lot, and there is overlap and there's influence. So, for instance, if you look at Avicenna, the first book of his canon deals with generalities, and in these generalities he describes, let's say, physiological processes and to a certain extent also anatomy, and that is then matched in some of his philosophical writings. So there's overlap. For instance, when he describes the inner senses. I don't want to go too far there, but basically, he develops certain ideas, and these ideas are both in his medical texts and in his philosophical works, and this is obviously no coincidence.
And does this also affect how they're building medical institutions like hospitals? Is there some crossover there in terms of?
Well, of course. So basically, the medical philosophy, the medical theory, the medical ideas are shaped to a certain extent also by the philosophical ideas. I mean, it's not like it's not one-to-one, because obviously there are two different domains and they differ with different questions. So if you deal with metaphysics, you know, like the chance that this will have a direct influence on medicine is relatively limited. But a hospital, for instance, Islamic hospitals are institutions under Islamic law. They are so-called awqaf, waqf. So they are endowments that have financial security, that have legal security because of their place, and that these legal endowments are linked to the idea of charity, zakat, in Arabic. So one of the 5 pillars of Islam. So these things, of course, are linked, but one has to recognize that many of the very detailed philosophical debates do not have a direct bearing on let's say practical medicine.
So when did the Islamic or Oriental world cease to lead in medical knowledge and innovation? I mean, you kind of foreshadowed a little bit earlier by saying it was to do with kind of how open and minded, or kind of how multicultural the area was, that made them sort of so far ahead. And at what point did that shift to Europe? Like, talk about that transition from.
Well, it's very hard. I mean, like people like these accounts of decline and fall. You mentioned earlier on this word "golden age," which I've used myself, but I mean it's a false image, because largely was no decline and fall. I mean, basically, the tradition continued, and to a certain extent, it still continues. And then at some stage, you know, it parted ways. So you have innovative medical thinking in the 17th century in the Ottoman Empire, for instance. You have translations from Latin into Arabic at that time. So, like, there's a new kind of medicine called Paracelsian medicine. So, going back to Paracelsus, you know, like a guy who rejects Galenic medicine and adds chemical elements, and so he has numerous followers, and so works of that nature get translated into Arabic, but this chemical medicine basically gets then integrated into the framework of humoral pathology, something with which Paracelsus would not have been very happy. So there are interesting developments and interesting engagements.
Is it fair to say you have like the big leaps with Ibn Sina and al-Razi? You have like these kind of this period.
No. I know. I think that's not fair to say, because for the most part there's very, very little research on what happens in medicine. Let's say in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. So I can't say that there are no al-Razis in the 17th or 18th century, because basically people haven't studied the medical texts. And with the West, the big break. I mean, like, so basically. Napoleon conquers Egypt. That's at the beginning of the 19th century. That's a bit of a shock for people. So from that time onwards, basically, Arab countries, or like Islamic countries, are confronted with a certain superiority of the West. But in medicine, if you look at how people would have treated somebody, let's say at the beginning of the 19th century in England, or let's say, I don't know, in Coventry, Cairo, or Calcutta, it would have been very similar, because they still adhere to many of these notions that have long been reformed. Now that changes by the time you get to the end of the 19th century. That has then changed radically, and then all of a sudden bacteria and viruses are discovered, all sorts of progress made, and this old stuff is then basically completely abandoned, and then you see like big shifts basically.
So would you say the big shift happened with the discovery of the kind of microscopic world? Is that the
sure, like in medicine, that's
the
19th and second half 19th century, like the number of things that happen. at that time, and basically then penicillin gets invented in the discovered, I should say, in the 1920s. So these are like the major, but they're all linked, but that basically in these 100 years from 1820 to 1920, medicine changes beyond recognition.
When you deal with these sort of ancient kind of texts that you're translating, how much of it feels like medicine and how much of it feels like sort of literary philosophy interpretation? How much of it this is kind of a technical thing, a medical thing, and how much of it is just general?
Well, it depends a little bit what you read, but the other day, I think, I looked with a student at a few passages from that the best doctor is also philosopher of Galen. So Galen writes certain works, and they are like very beautifully crafted sentences and passages in there. So they can appear, and he can be sarcastic and stuff like that. So there can be a certain pleasure to reading it. But from a literary point of view, a lot of it is simply dull. You don't open medical textbooks or like recipe collections and expect to find poetry. Now, when I say medical collections and poetry, there is quite a bit of medical poetry as well. Nicander, for instance, wrote something on drugs, and that's quoted in Galen quite a bit. So you can actually find some poetry even in a book on simple drugs by Galen. But that poetry is also maybe not, it's not my favorite Greek poetry, let's put it that way.
So as a professor at the University of Manchester, how do you introduce students to this kind of it's very cross-cultural journey? Are most of your students already fluent in Arabic? Like, this is sort of your space to kind of recruitment space.
So it depends on what at what level. So basically, the undergraduates hardly ever have Arabic. Some of them are learning Greek. I don't teach Arabic here at the university, or I'm not in the Arabic department. I'm in the classics department. So I taught, I had a visiting student from Pakistan now, and I taught her some Arabic, but generally speaking, I don't give Arabic classes. I don't read Arabic texts with students. But even Greek medical texts, I hardly ever read with students, because the students in my history of medicine class, they get everything in translation, basically.
As an aside, how many languages can you read and speak in terms of when
you mean me personally?
Yeah.
I need languages because, I'm a classicist. Of course, I know Latin and Greek, and I know Syriac and Arabic and Hebrew, and then I read a number of modern languages and speak some as well. But because it's such a cross culture. So we talked about Maimonides, for instance, and so you have some Jews, and then there might be something in Judeo-Arabic, so it's if you want to be at the cutting edge of this field, it is helpful to know a number of languages and to have worked with manuscripts as well. I think, I don't want to put myself on a pedestal or anything, but so my training was, for instance, in Greek paleography, and then I came to Arabic paleography, but I've worked with Arabic, Greek, even Latin, and Hebrew manuscripts firsthand. And so basically that's a very useful skill to have, because, for instance, there are manuscripts that, let's say, like the Arabic manuscripts at the Escorial, contain Hebrew annotations, and then it is a useful skill to be able to read this. It's a cross-cultural environment, and do you
have any tips for someone who's trying to learn a language? Or?
Well, my tip is what my good friend in Paris told me. Il faut apprendre les langues sur l'oreiller. You have to learn languages on the pillow. So basically, try to meet people and speak modern languages in a friendly environment. Basically, that's that's something. But if you want to learn something like Greek or Latin, of course, there's no you have to read text, you have to memorize things. But I'm somebody who's very oral AU, so I like to listen to text. So even when I learn Greek, I would have a tape and have somebody read Homer, for instance, and I fall asleep like that, just to make sure that I get the sound of the language as well.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, Greek and Latin, they're not really dead languages. So.
Oh, and where are you finding these texts? Like, obviously, there's some of these texts are in libraries, etc. But
yeah, mostly libraries. So basically, the big collections. I mean, like Oxford, Cambridge, London, Paris, Madrid. Like Istanbul, Cairo. I don't know. Like these are like some of the biggest collections in the world. So probably like for Arabic manuscripts, probably Istanbul is the most important place.
Do you have a piece of advice to offer to potential prospective students or anyone who kind of wants to explore this kind of ancient science, Greco-Arabic traditions, translations, medicine?
Yeah, I mean, like just start with a recent handbook article or something like that, or like some introductory text. I mean, I've written a number, but doesn't have to be me. Yeah, so Helen King wrote like a very short book on medicine. Like it. So there are like many introductory works. You could start there. If you want to work in earnest, you will probably need to learn some languages. So. Start early with that if you can. The earlier the better. I mean, learning languages is just such a fantastic thing, So, and come talk to us, So come talk to me or my colleagues or wherever you are. I mean, nowadays it's so. I mean, I sometimes get emails from high school students in the US. They say, "Oh, I'm doing this project," and then I would write a short email back and say, well, have you thought about this, that, or the other? So contact people and seek advice. I mean, it's very easy to start on your own, especially, like these texts, they're difficult. So seek help and seek guidance.
Well, without getting too existential, do you have a kind of a dream of what you want to kind of accomplish? Like, there's certain things you want to be able to translate or something?
Yes, I do. So I have just applied for a project to do Avicenna's Canon, Book 3. That's a 7-year project. And so I'm now in my mid-50s, so I'm 54, I think, or 53, turning 54.
You've lost count.
No, I mean, like, I'm born in 71, so it hasn't been my birthday yet, so I'm 53. So this project would see me to 61, and then I can probably do one more 7-year period, and then we would be able to do the whole canon. So it's 5 books, but book 3 is, like, extremely long. It's 300,000 words. The rest is 400,000 words. So I think if we do book 3 in the first 7 years, and then books 1, 2, 4 and 5 in the next 7 years, that would be absolutely wonderful and would be a great legacy, because it's the single most important medical text that exists, pre-modern medical text, the canon of medicine. There's no edition, so there's no decent edition, there's no decent English translation. I mean, many of the English translations are absolute jokes, and there's only one which is complete, and it's horrible. So, I'd like to do that if I can.
Well, Professor Pormann, thank you so much. It's been a privilege and
a pleasure.
And a pleasure, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to catch up again and you can update us on how these projects are going.
Okay, thanks, Will. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.